Welcome to a conversation with Lito Camacho, Vice Chairman of Credit Suisse in Asia Pacific. Mr. Camacho, global investors are very interested in this region. Can you tell us what role Asia plays in the global economy right now?
Well, I think the role of Asia in the global economy has particularly been highlighted by the experience of the last 2 years as we went through the financial crisis. As the Western economies were going through on a downward spin, Asia as a region continued to grow, and I think it's highlighting the inherent strength of the Asian economies, anchored by places like China and India, but others as well. Places like Vietnam, Indonesia, even the Philippines, where I come from, enjoyed positive growth, as many of the economies around the world were going through negative GDP growth, and I think this is really changing the role of Asia as we go through the next few decades to come. It is my belief that growth in Asia will continue to be quite robust. It only gets better if the Western economies were to recover stronger. This is also changing really the role of Asia in the global platform. And I think one clear evidence of this is the G20, the formation of the G20. Whereas in the past, most of the economic debates, discussions, on global issues were happening at the G7, G8 forum. Today, they've created the G20, where Asia is represented by 5 or 6 economies from the region in this global platform. Politically, you can even say that we're moving in the direction of a G2, where China and the U.S. are becoming the 2 major powers, having discussions around political issues. So I think certainly the role of Asia in this new world of ours has evolved, and I think that's evolving further, where it will take even a stronger role.
As a former finance minister, what could derail a sustained economic recovery in Asia?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because we shouldn't be overconfident. I think while Asia has certainly enjoyed this positive growth even through the crisis, there are of course risks lurking around. It wasn't too long ago, and then just before the financial crisis of the last 2 years, the biggest challenge facing Asia at the time was really inflation. With high growth, economic growth, and the increase in prices in most of the commodities that are very heavily demanded by the growth in Asia, inflation was beginning to lurk in. I believe that as the economic recovery takes foothold, inflation will start to come up again as a risk. You're already seeing this in some parts of Asia. I mean, India, for example, where the Indian Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of India, has already signaled the need to raise interest rates. They've done that through other measures. The Reserve Bank of Australia has done similar, raising of interest rates. More recently, Thailand, I think, the Bank of Thailand has signaled that inflation is becoming to show its head again, and therefore central banks around the region, I think, will have to start addressing inflation. Now, it's really a fine balance between sustaining economic recovery and making sure that it does not come with inflation, doesn't come with asset bubbles, as it were. I think the one good thing about Asia, though, is that it has gone through some of these experiences before. 10 years ago, we went through the Asian financial crisis. And I believe that many of our Asian governments, Asian corporates, Asian households, Asian banks have restructured themselves very successfully to be able to cope with these challenges. And you see that. I mean, for instance, China. I mean, there are a lot of talks about asset bubbles forming in China, particularly in the real estate sector. And you see the government, making very clear signals and taking measures to address this issue. Even in Singapore, where I am based, as the slightest sign of price increases in real estate happening too quickly, you see the government responding immediately with some measures to try to depress demand for real estate. So I think that the Asian governments have the tools to address this, but they risk nonetheless. I think another risk factor for Asia, of course, is politics. I mean, particularly in Southeast Asia. I come from a country, the Philippines, where political events happen every so often, and they do tend to to present some tense moments, not only for their citizens but for investors as well, and that's just something that's part of the landscape in the Asia Pacific region.
It's very interesting. Are you surprised? I mean, what you were describing was more nuanced movements by the governments in Asia, whether it's inflation or asset bubbles here and there. Are you surprised at looking back 10 years ago to now, with the fact that the U.S. and many European nations have had to make such drastic interventions within their economies?
Well, when you look at the experience of Asia 10 years ago and you reflect upon what has happened in the last 2 years, particularly in the developed economies in the U.S. and many European economies, it shouldn't be surprising, because some of the measures that had to be employed to address the excesses, shall we say, that went on in Asia prior to the Asian financial crisis, over-leverage, mismatch of assets and liabilities. These are some of the issues that we are confronting, except on a much bigger scale in the global stage. And so when you think about what had to be done by the Western governments, it shouldn't be surprising. In fact, you could say that they could have taken lessons from some of the actions taken by the Asian governments. There was certainly a lot of rescue programs that were done during that time. And perhaps the next set of lessons to be learned is really how to unwind those, because I think that's a challenge now facing many of the policymakers and governments, particularly in the Western economies, as we need to exit many of these programs that had to be done over the last 2 years. The reprivatization of many of the institutions that had to be rescued. Many of the assets had to be taken by the government, taking away the guarantees that were provided to banks and other types of institutions. There has to be an orderly way of exiting those programs.
Switching gears a little bit from governments to corporates or companies, you spend a lot of time talking to companies around the region. Have you noticed that their ambitions have changed in the past 6 months?
I think not just in the last 6 months, but for sure in the last few years. I think you see today an Asian region that has developed a certain level of confidence. And as I've mentioned, the positive experience through the financial crisis, I think, has reinforced this confidence. And I think you can sense that when you travel around the world. If you were traveling around the world in the last 2 years, going through the many, through the financial centers, New York, London, Zurich, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Singapore, I think you will see that sense of confidence that you see among Asian business people, Asian business leaders. And I think that's really reflected upon some of the transactions that we're seeing today. For instance, 20 years ago, if you would have seen a lot of Western multinationals coming to Asia looking to do joint ventures so that they could get cheap manufacturing in Asia, looking for acquisitions in Asia, again, primarily to look for cheap labor. Move the clock 20 years later to today. I was just in Korea, and interestingly, we visited many companies that are looking to acquire European companies, U.S. companies, and this time around, with a strong operating base in Asia, looking for companies in the West where they could acquire technologies, brands, and so on and so forth. So you've seen almost a reversal of roles. And even within Asia, prior to the last 2 years or 3 years, you still saw a lot of European American companies looking to buy in Asia. A lot of the financial sponsors, private equity funds. In the last 2 years, even deals that are happening in Asia, you see Asian companies becoming a real major player. For example, Credit Suisse advised the sale of 3 generating companies in Singapore. Not surprisingly, first asset was bought by a Chinese group, second asset was bought by a Japanese consortium, and the third one by a Malaysian conglomerate. I think you would not have seen that just a few years ago. So I think that's new Asia. You've got Asian businessmen who are confident with their current operations, confident about the future, with the sense that they can assert themselves as global leaders in their particular sectors.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Camacho.
Thank you, Doug.